But first, it's been almost 3 weeks since the mass shootings in El Paso and Dayton, and President Trump has again seemingly changed his mind on what gun reforms he is willing to consider. William Brangham continues our periodic look at some of the proposed reforms to try to reduce the bloodshed caused by guns in America.
We are in the midst of a grim cycle. A tragic mass shooting occurs. A community, in this case, two communities, grieve the loss of innocent lives. Thoughts and prayers turn to calls for action. Political leaders promise to do something, but then, in many cases, action does not materialize. We do this occasional look at the NewsHour at what might be done and whether any of those proposed reforms would actually save lives. There's talk now of universal background checks for every single gun transaction in America. There's talk of more red flag laws where people can alert authorities of trouble with someone who has weapons. But we're going to look now at the idea that some say should be on the table as well, to limit high-capacity magazines, which give a shooter the ability to fire off more and more rounds before they have to stop and reload. I'm joined now by David Chipman of the Giffords Center, the gun safety group. Chipman spent 25 years as a special agent at the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, where he focused in part on gun trafficking. Welcome to the NewsHour.
Thanks for having me.
For people who have not been following this debate or haven't held firearms or don't understand how guns operate, tell us a little bit more. What is a high-capacity magazine?
So in a semi-automatic weapon, a weapon that every time you pull the trigger, a round is fired, there's a metal box and spring in which rounds of ammunition are held, and so it is self-loading every time you pull the trigger. It also gives you the opportunity to reload really quickly. It's almost as if you press a button, a printer cartridge falls out, and you can insert another one. This is very different than what the first gun I had at ATF, which was a revolver, or what you would see it on Westworld.
It's like an old, six-shooter or Western
style. Yeah, which you have to drop individual rounds in, and then if you were in a gunfight, to actually reload, we used to train for hours for that. So this is sort of the 2.0 of weapons today, and it makes them very, very lethal.
And high capacity means what kind of numbers are we talking about?
Yeah, so I think the consensus has been around 10. And there are a number of reasons why.
So 10 and above would be high?
Yeah, well, I think, let's say 10 and below are okay or reasonable. Above would be regulated. And I think this comes basically based on a guess. You know, it's sort of like picking a speed limit. It should be 55 or 65. What we do know is in NYPD, they've examined over the years how many rounds are fired in a deadly encounter. And even amongst police, the number is below 5 on average. So you'd think twice as much of that would allow any citizen to properly defend themselves. When I was on ATF SWAT team, my sidearm had 15 rounds, my shotgun had 6. I did have an assault rifle, which could hold 30, but I was also tracking and hunting down the most dangerous armed Americans, which really isn't the job of a civilian.
Right. So why do we care in this conversation about high-capacity magazines when we're talking about trying to limit the carnage of mass shootings?
I think it's like a flu shot, and the bumper sticker that people who are against this say, well, it won't stop a shooting. Actually, that might be correct. What it might stop, though, is a killer from transforming into a killing machine. Just look at the assassination attempt of my boss, Gabby Giffords. She was shot with the first or second round. No capacity limit would have protected her, but perhaps her staffer wouldn't have been killed, a federal judge wouldn't have been killed, or a 9-year-old child wouldn't have been killed if that shooter did not have a 32-round magazine, twice the size of the magazine I had on my ATF-issued gun.
So the idea is if you limit the size of these magazines or the capacity of the magazine, it's a moment to intervene. If a mass shooting is going on and that person has to stop to reload and take that magazine out and put a new one in, that's a moment for the good people in that environment to try to stop that event.
Yeah, and that's what happened in Tucson. Unfortunately, it happened after 32 rounds were fired. But in that case, those surviving people who were there tackled the shooter. In law enforcement, we're trained for that lull in gunfire. It allows us a tactical advance. And the reality is, despite what you see in Die Hard and other movies, it is really hard to reload. You have to train very hard, especially under pressure if you're being shot at.
So right now there are magazines that go up to how big? I mean, how you mentioned 30 in the Tucson shooter. How big are magazines now?
Yeah, what's frightening is we're seeing drum magazines at 100 now. We saw that
100 rounds.
100 rounds, which is interesting for a rifle because when you buy a box of ammunition for that kind of caliber, they're only 20 to a box. So this one magazine would be 5 boxes of ammunition. We first saw this in Aurora being used, and most recently in Dayton we saw it used. Another episode was in Las Vegas. Most of the media focused on the use of a bump stock there, which allowed for the shooting to happen more quickly. But really, one of the results and why this person was able to kill dozens of people and wound hundreds was the fact that he too had 80 and 100 round magazines. So it's just math. If you're firing that many rounds downrange and there are people there, you're going to hit more people. You don't have to aim as precisely, and death tolls increase. And so looking at magazines is kind of like a flu shot. Perhaps you don't stop the flu in every case, but you can prevent a lot of it. And I think that's what we're trying to do here.
So are there states right now that are limiting magazine sales to 10? I mean, I understand that there are probably millions of these high-capacity magazine clips that are already out there in the population. But there are states now that are trying to limit the number of these?
Yes, and there are 9 states now and the District of Columbia that do this. The first state that I was involved in this conversation was right after Sandy Hook in Colorado moved forward with regulating the size and capacity. And now Congressman Ted Deutsch, who represents the area of Parkland where we had the school shooting, he's introduced a House bill that would regulate the future manufacture and sale at 10 rounds.
Now, California, as you know, and Vermont also recently saw their own attempts to limit high-capacity magazines thrown out by the courts, arguing that it's an infringement upon the Second Amendment. Isn't that an obstacle to this effort?
Sure. I mean, any policy decision or way we go has to be satisfied in the courts. That's one court decision. We'll have to see if other courts address it the same way. But it seems to me a very reasonable approach. Talking to any gun owner, a 100-round magazine is just not traditional. It's not normal, and I can't think of a purpose beyond killing a lot of people for having it. So if the debate is, should it be 10 or what have you, it can't be 100. And so I think there's room where we can have progress, although we will not have perfection.
David Chipman of the Giffords Center, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.